Hello everyone, I hope you're having an amazing day, but today we have wild weather that is building across the United States. We have severe straight-line winds across all of the East Coast, flooding up near New York and Philadelphia, hurricane warnings in place for Florida, excessive heat building in the south, severe storms in the northern plains, and a fire outbreak in the west. There is a lot to cover today, but our main story will be this hurricane in Florida and South Carolina. Let's first start off with the big story, and it is this tropical system that is brewing currently over Cuba. Right where the red is where the system is right now. Cuba is about right here. There's your Texas coastline, Louisiana, then Florida panhandle. And as you can see, the system is just spinning around in the Atlantic. If you watch this loop, you can see it's really started to get a lot of convection, which is storms in the middle of it, which means that this is intensifying, and it was just named a couple hours ago. This is now Tropical Storm Debby. It was Tropical Depression 4 before, but now it is Tropical Storm with 40-mile-per-hour winds. So if we look over at the National Hurricane Center, these are the official outlooks for this hurricane. So there's Debby right there. You can see the position of it. And here's the current cone of Debby. So currently it is just the weakest that a tropical storm can be, which is 40 miles per hour. But as it nears Florida, it will continue to intensify until it makes landfall in the Big Bend as a hurricane. This should hopefully only be a Category 1 hurricane in Florida. But as you can see, tropical storm warnings are already in for the Keys and all of the Gulf Coast of Florida. Even parts of the Panhandle are under hurricane watches and warnings. But most models agree this hurricane should make landfall in the Big Bend. Then this hurricane is supposed to track over Florida and Georgia very slowly, and then it's supposed to stall out in the Atlantic. While it stalls out right over here in between South Carolina and Florida, that little corridor right there, it should intensify as the waters are pretty ripe there. Also with this system, there is virtually no shear, so there is nothing really stopping this besides from the land. The reason why this hurricane is going to stall is because we're going to have two ridges, which basically means two areas of high pressure. So we have our normal Bermuda high right over here. Generally, this makes everything go in that direction. And then we also have one building over the central United States. That high pressure system also is clockwise, so it's making everything go this way. So you can see the hurricane is kind of going to be trapped right over here in between these two, which is why it's going to stall out. Now hopefully this won't happen, because as most of you guys know, in the East Coast, Hurricane Florence also stalled out, and that caused around 30 inches of rain to fall in the Carolinas. And that was really bad flooding. Highways were closed for weeks. Now, right now, we're pretty far out from the landfall on the East Coast, so we can't go too high on how intense this might be, because things could either shift to be really weak on the East Coast. They could stay how they are, which is supposed to be a high-end tropical storm hitting South Carolina, or it could go up and become a hurricane that hits South Carolina, North Carolina, or Georgia. So I'm going to draw real quick our potential landfall spots. So for our first landfall, this is where it could make landfall. Basically anywhere in the Big Bend of Florida. And then once it goes back out, this storm still has a chance that hopefully it will just ride up here and not make another landfall. But sadly, that would cause a lot of flooding. But if it does end up going back to sea right over here, then anywhere from Jacksonville all the way up to the Outer Banks could be in for a landfall. So basically the entire southeast coast could be in for a second landfall. Now the higher up that the landfall is, so the closer to North Carolina that the landfall is, the stronger the hurricane will be. So it'll have more time to develop in the waters. If this hurricane just goes right out to sea and then makes landfall again, it will probably just be a weak tropical storm, because it didn't have that much time to redevelop, and hurricanes cannot develop over land. So this might seem like a lot. This is what we call spaghetti models. So this is basically all of the models that are tracking this hurricane right now, and these are all the possible tracks. So as you can see, most of them agree anywhere from the Panhandle and all of the Big Bend is where our first landfall could be. And then you can see some of the models continue to just take it inland and never take it back out to sea. But what a lot of them like to do is bring it back out to sea and then hit either South Carolina. Now with the newest runs, we don't have any that hit North Carolina, but a lot that hit South Carolina. And then right here are the same models that you just saw, but this time for intensity. So anywhere in this yellow right here, that is Category 1, and anywhere in this green right here is a tropical storm. Now I feel like the models are really underdoing the intensity. If I were to draw up an intensity plot, it would be like this. So we'd had a Category 1 hitting the Big Bend in Florida, then it would weaken, of course, but not weaken too much. And then once it regains its strength in the land, it starts to go up. Once it nears landfall, it kind of caps out because some of it's over land, some of it's not. and then starts to de-intensify. So that's more like what I would think, but these are all the models right now. Do not make any decisions off of the spaghetti models I just showed you. The only thing that you should be using for evacuations or to know what's going on is the National Hurricane Center's graphic, which was the first one that I showed you. And then right here are our sea surface temperatures. Anywhere that is yellow is quite favorable for tropical storms. Anywhere that is red or pink is very favorable. And as you can see, our system should go through here. So it's currently just north of Cuba. It should go around right here. And as you can see, as it nears Florida, it has very, very ripe waters. And then once it goes back out to sea, the Gulf Stream should feed this storm. And then once it makes landfall again, as you can see, the temperatures closer to the coast are not as warm, so it shouldn't be able to intensify as it's making landfall, but before it makes landfall, it should be still intensifying. And then of course it goes out here into extratropical waters. Now I'm going to show you a couple of models. These are just one model run. The models are normally wrong, but these are possibilities of what could happen. So down here, right over here, is Florida. So as you can see, there's our system down there in the Gulf Coast of Florida, and it really intensifies right before landfall. This one's having the landfall be more of a panhandle landfall, and it's showing a moderate to weak Category 1 hurricane. And then it has it go over Florida and Georgia. It takes its sweet time, and then it re-enters the Atlantic at around Tuesday the 6th at around 1 p.m. Eastern time. And then it really starts to stall out over here, but it intensifies as it's stalling out. So right here, we have a tropical storm or Category 1 hurricane right over here. And this is Thursday the 8th at around late night, so around 12 to 1 a.m. And then landfall at about 6 a.m. in the Georgia-South Carolina border. So this is the newest run of the GFS, so this is the American model. And remember that this is not exactly what's going to happen. This is just a possibility of what could happen. Now let's look at the 12Z run of the Euro model. So as you can see, this has the same system riding the Gulf Coast of Florida. And then really, I do not think that the Euro is doing that good of a job, because honestly, this shows a very weak tropical storm making landfall. So right there, an 1,000 millibar tropical storm making landfall in Florida. The system that we have right now, it's already at around 1,000 millibars. There's no way that it's going to not intensify in the Gulf of Mexico. Then it shows the system quickly crossing the land and re-entering the Atlantic, then strengthening to a hurricane, but with a really big core. So this could be possible, this really big core that it has, because currently what we're seeing is the system is very, very big on satellite. And then it shows a landfall around Charleston. And then the Euro is showing a weak Category 1 hurricane on Thursday, August 8th at around 2 p.m. Eastern time. And then that system rushes off to the north. Now let's look at the latest run of the Icon, the 18Z run. Now this shows a weak tropical storm making landfall in the Big Bend of Florida. Then it crosses Florida and slightly enters the Atlantic. As you can see, it kind of rides the coast of Georgia and Florida. Then it breaks off on Tuesday late at night and intensifies as it goes off the sea, really rapidly intensifies. This is showing a Category 2 hurricane now, straight out in the Atlantic. And then it is showing this hurricane, looks like it tries to make landfall around Emerald Isle, North Carolina, as a strong Category 2, maybe even a major hurricane with this 958 millibar reading. That I feel like is very, very unlikely, as we do have this high pressure system in the central United States. That one is pushing closer to the system, so that's kind of going to try to push it to more of a southern landfall, like a South Carolina or Georgia landfall. So I'm not all too sure about a North Carolina landfall, but that obviously is still a possibility. Now the 12Z run of the GDPS. Now this is not a very fun run for weather enthusiasts. They do not like this run. But this is obviously still a possibility and hopefully will happen for the sake of people's life and property. So as we play this through, as you can see, it has a weak tropical storm landfall more in the panhandle of Florida. It really isn't showing in the southwest Atlantic view. And then as you can see, it does not re-enter the Atlantic. It just continues the ride up the east coast. It does not re-enter the Atlantic. So that is really something we have to keep in mind. So the more that this system hugs the coast of Florida, the more that it will be able to intensify in the Atlantic and have a stronger landfall over here on the east coast. The more that it hugs the Gulf of Mexico and tries to hit a panhandle, then it will more ride the east coast states and not really re-enter the Atlantic. And if it goes straight for the Big Bend, it should just have the same outcome as it would if it hit somewhere like Tampa Bay. Now also remember, we are not even close to peak season yet. Peak season is around the middle of September, and we are in early August. So things are just starting to ramp up, and we should see a lot more tropical activity very soon. As I said before, the West is having basically a wildfire outbreak. All of these fire icons that you see, that's where wildfires are happening currently. The biggest one being the Park Fire that we reported on last week because it had a fire NATO in it. Currently, this has burned 401,000 acres in California. This is one of the biggest wildfires I have ever seen. This is a crazy wildfire. 401,000 acres. That is insane. And I am in Colorado right now, and there's an unusual amount of wildfires on the Front Range. On screen right now, you can see photos that I took of the Corey Fire just south of Denver. This fire has only burned 480 acres because of lots of air help, and it is 10% contained, but this fire is definitely still spreading. Now let's look at your high temperatures for this week. So for today, which is Saturday, you can see that most of the Great Plains is in the hundreds, and it is very warm. Most of the East Coast is in the low 90s. We have had a nice cool down in the East Coast lately. And the West is very dry and very warm, which is why all of these fires are happening. Looking at tomorrow, Sunday, it is much of the same with the Great Plains heating up, the West continuing to be really hot, and the East Coast starting to cool down again. Looking at our temperatures for Monday, as you can see, the North is really starting to cool off with 70s and 60s in some place. Be sure to enjoy that cool off. Great Plains is still heating up, and the East Coast is starting to heat up, especially around Maryland. Southwest is continuing to be really hot, but the Northwest is starting to cool off just a couple of degrees, not noticeably though. Now for Tuesday, the Great Lakes states and the Northeast are starting to cool off as well into the 70s. Be sure to enjoy that. I know I would hope I would have some 70s around here. Also, the Rockies are starting to cool off, but the Southwest still remains really hot, and the Southern Plains remains really hot. Also, Dixie remains to be in the 100s. Now for Wednesday, it's much of the same. All of the northern United States is in 80s, 70s, and even 60s in some places. The South Central United States is continuing to be in the 100s, and the Southwest is continuing to be hot. Now for Thursday, the middle of the United States is also starting to get in on the 80s, but the southern United States is still in 90s and 100s. And for Friday, it is much of the same, except for the southern United States is now in the low 100s and 90s. Here are the places that could see flash flooding today in the United States. Areas in the green, you could see a very isolated flash flood event. Areas in the yellow, you could see 1 or 2 flash flood events. Excessive rainfall for tomorrow, it is also the green areas where you can see a very isolated event. But then also down in Florida, we have a moderate area, which means a 40% chance of the flash flood within 25 miles of a point. So that's where you could see a couple flash flood events, and that is from Debby. And then for some reason, the map is not loading for day 3, which is Monday, but it is flash flooding across Florida. For severe weather today, we have 2 slight risks. One for the East Coast, which is driven by wind and wind only, and then one in the Northern Plains, which is driven by wind and hail. Hail is the main threat, as there could be some big hail falling. For tomorrow, we have a couple of marginal risks. The ones in the north are driven by wind and hail, and then the one over Florida is a small tornado risk and a small wind risk from Debby. And then for Monday, we have another marginal risk down in the south from Debby, and we have a wind-driven risk in the north. Looking at next week, Sunday to Saturday, as you can see, we should have a cool-off in the northeast in the mid-Atlantic. But things are still going to be really warm in the southern United States and in the western United States. And then looking at next week for rainfall, it shouldn't be too far off from normal, except for a little bit of above average rain in the northwest. And besides from that, everywhere else should be pretty normal. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you have any questions or helpful criticism, be sure to tell me in the comments below. But besides from that, have an amazing rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.